Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the new school. We have the great fortune of having two of ELT's most respected and influential voices with us here tonight, Jeremy Harmer and Scott Thornbury. They are longtime colleagues and friends, and they are both faculty on the new school's MA TESOL program. And they have generously offered to let us listen in on their conversation about communicative language teaching, what we have gained and what we might have lost. This conversation promises to be more than gentle musings, I suspect. Earlier this week, Jeremy met with a group of our ESL faculty in the new school program, and we asked him, who is your hero in ELT? And I hope this is okay, Jeremy. But his answer was Scott Thornbury. Scott Thornbury is one of my heroes in ELT because I respect him and because we have really good fights. So here's to good friends and good fights and the insights and opportunities that happen in those opposing views. And thank you for letting us listen in on them tonight. So enjoy Jeremy Harmer and Scott Thornbury.
Thank you. Thank you, Caitlin. Just a little explanation of the format. I mean, we had trouble deciding whether we'd call this a debate or a discussion or a conversation. It's an emergent phenomenon. We'll see what it turns into. It's going to start off looking a little bit like a presidential debate. We decided sitting down would be too casual, and you would be expecting something a little bit more formal, but not as formal perhaps as other talks, public talks that have been given in here during the summer MA TESOL program. So let me just explain. The subject is the communicative approach or communicative language teaching, and if that's not familiar to you, I hope it will become familiar during the course of the next hour. It is something that both Jeremy and I have been intimately involved in all our professional career, and it seemed to be a very good subject to address, given that we're both here in New York at the same time. So how we're going to structure this is I'm going to start off with, I'm going to interview, in a sense, Jeremy for half an hour about his take on the communicative approach, and then he's going to do the same for another half an hour, and then we'll throw it open to you guys for question and answers from the floor. We don't have a huge amount of time, but we'll try and allow lots of voices to be heard. And when that starts to, when we reach a critical point, we'll move in that direction. You can continue the conversation over there. So I'm going to start off then by a little bit of background, asking Jeremy things that I don't really know, because I mean, I only met Jeremy, well, I've known him for a very long time, but not way back in the mists of time when he was already a prominent figure in the history of the communicative approach. So Jeremy, before we go on to discussing this communicative approach specifically, can you just sketch in your background in ELT and how you got into it in the first place?
Well, I think like many people, I didn't intend to be an EL teacher, an English language teacher. That wasn't the plan. I did a little bit of teaching between school and university, but we won't go into that because it was very different. And then after university, I was messing around doing other things, and in particular, desperately trying to make a living as a singer-songwriter. The only problem about that is that I couldn't find anyone who had the same extraordinarily high opinion of my fantastic talent as I did. And the result was it wasn't going so well. And this is literally true. And I think for those of us who are whatever you might call us native speakers, this is quite a common trajectory. I met someone who said, you can go to this place in London and do a 4-week course. And at the end of 4 weeks, you can get a job teaching almost anywhere. And I wasn't particularly interested in the idea of teaching, but the almost anywhere sounded rather attractive. And so I went along and did what was a 4-week course. If you compare that with a country like Finland, where people train to be teachers for 5 years or so, there's something absurd about it. However, we were all university graduates and so on and so forth. And to shorten this down, and in those 4 weeks, not all of us had this experience, but I suddenly found sometime around the second or third week that I was actually rather enjoying it. And there seemed to be some kind of fit between the sort of things I liked and it. So that's how I got into it. And it was a place called International House in London, and which is a big part of the story for many people, especially in Britain, but not only in Britain. That's how I got into it.
Just on that subject, how would you characterize the kind of training that you got? What was the prevailing method, if you like?
I think what you have to know about International House is that these teacher training courses, when they started, and I wasn't there at the beginning, I promise, it was a little later, but they were started as a direct riposte almost to the idea that you train to be a teacher by studying things. And the guy who founded International House, a man called John Haycraft, had it in his mind that teaching is essentially a practical issue. It's an issue of what happens in classrooms between people doing things with other people. And so he was instrumental in starting this kind of course, which was incredibly practical. Of course, we talked about what a phoneme was and different phonemes and that kind of thing, but what we mainly did from the very first day is stand up and do it. How would I characterize it? Well, the prevailing method, and this causes a lot of trouble in terms of what a method is, but it was offered to us, I believe, as a method, when in fact it isn't a method, it's just a procedure, was something that we'd now call PPP, which is essentially taking an item of grammar, creating a lovely situation in which the one I did with some students here the other day is where a man's in prison and you make a big joke of this. He's poor man, he's in prison, and as a result he can't drink champagne and he can't go to the cinema and all this kind of thing. And so you teach that kind of thing with bags of fireworks and engagement and lots of repetition. He can't go to the cinema. Everybody, he can't go to the cinema. That kind of thing. And then the students would repeat. And then when they'd repeated lots, I'd then get them to say, now tell me what you can do and what you can't do. Does that sound familiar? That's a sort of, it wasn't all we did, but I think it was the kind of prevailing kind of procedure that we all got good at. And as teacher trainees, of course, we all worried about getting the little bits in exactly the right order. And, should I do this first or that first? That's what teachers do at the beginning. Help, what do I do first? That was the kind of thing we did, I think.
Well, then let me jump forward a little. In 1982, you published an important paper on the communicative approach in English Language Teaching Journal, in which you defined the nature of what a communicative activity is. And I know that for a fact because that same paper was kind of used as the basis of a chapter in your not long after published Practice of English Language Teaching, the first edition. At that stage, I was training teachers in both London and Spain and Egypt, and that chapter was extremely important in my training because in it, Jeremy had outlined what he had identified as the 6 key fundamental characteristics of a communicative activity. And in fact, I've scanned and photocopied it here because it was a kind of mantra on our training courses. The trainee teachers had to kind of learn this by heart because this was it. This was crystallized what a communicative activity, and included things like it had to have a communicative purpose, a desire to communicate. The focus was on content, not form or formal accuracy. That a variety of language would be used in a communicative activity. It wasn't focused entirely on a specific grammatical structure. There was little or no teacher intervention and little materials control. Now, Jeremy, where did this come from? Because, I mean, you said you were trained in a rather kind of drill-type approach, and yet somewhere along the line you discovered or you invented or whatever the communicative approach. I'm really curious as to what preceded that publication of that article.
I wish I had invented it. It came from... It's a very good question because almost, if you talk to almost any teacher in the world, they will say I'm a communicative teacher. But when it all started, it meant something, I think, very specific. Where did it come from? It came from a number of different places. In the first place, the sociolinguist, Del Hymes, the quote that everyone will remember of his is, "There are rules of use without which the rules of grammar are meaningless." And sociolinguists started to make a lot of noise and saying, no, it's not just about knowing how to the past tense or the future tense. It's knowing how to use it. And so we all read up, and in sociolinguistics, you read up about how to address someone in Burundi, because it's different from how you address someone in New York. How do Japanese people talk to each other? Now, I know exactly what I'm saying. You can't say Japanese people as a whole. But you study, the fact is, if I was learning Japanese, I wouldn't need to just learn Japanese. I'd need to learn how to address people in Japan using the language that I was learning. So the way you use the language is as important as the grammar of the language. That's the first thing. The second thing was that a lot of people started talking about language functions, which is closely allied to Delheim's. And a little bit of history here, just to forgive me if this is old knowledge to you, but way back in about 1976 or something, a book was published which was a kind of Festschrift, a collection of articles by a man called J.L. Austin, who was a philosopher. So his thing was philosophy, and after his death, his students got together and published his collection of his work. And this seeped into philosophy, sociolinguistics, seeped into the way applied linguistics were talking about language. In particular, the thing that we all latched onto, and you're very familiar with, was the idea of what he called performatives. And a performative is a philosophical construct of a word which performs the action that it says. So, for example, remember, we're talking about years and years ago, but a performative, for example, if I say, I promise you, the word promise actually performs the action of promising. It's different from saying, I see you, because that word does not perform the action of seeing. I'm telling you about something. But if I say, I disagree with you, the word disagree actually does the job of disagreeing. I promise, and the one that everyone quotes, I name this ship Queen Mary. And the verb to name, names. And this kind of fed into the Delheim stuff and led other people to start talking about what language means. Now, of course, we know that language, if I say, I saw a dog, we know that it means see, dog, or something like that. If I say, it's warm in here, I'm simply making a comment about the temperature. But I might be doing something else entirely. I might be saying, it's warm in here, and what I'm asking you to do is to open the window. In other words, the ordinary denotational meaning of it's warm in here is not what I'm after. What I'm after is for you to open the window. It's warm in here may denote the temperature, but its function, or its illocutionary force, to be technical, what I'm trying to achieve is the opening of the window. So if, and it gets very easy. So if I say to you, why don't you open the window? Well, we know what the words mean, but the function of why don't you open the window is a suggestion. Or if I say it in a different way, I might say, why don't you open the window? We might have gone beyond suggestion into some. So that was the second strand. And one man in particular encapsulated that in a very famous book in the UK, written in 1976, published in 1976, called Notional Syllabuses. And his name was David Wilkins, and we both have a connection with him. And I went and did my master's in applied linguistics at the University of Reading in the UK, specifically because of him. And what he did is he tried to explain to us a brand new concept. He can't drink champagne is not the same kind of language learning as, would you like a cup of champagne, a glass of champagne? Which is offering a glass of champagne. And what David Wilkins did, carrying on from these kind of thoughts of performatives and functions, is say, look, language actually performs things. There's the meaning, but there's what you want to do. And that was unbelievably, I mean, I hesitate to say it now, but at the time I just remember going, wow. So that's one big strand. What do you want to say?
Yes, I mean, what's interesting is that this confirms what I understand about the origins of the communicative approach. It was actually driven by linguistics, or sociolinguistics, even philosophy, rather than methodology as such. But where did the methodology come from? Which, I mean, it's one thing to know that language has functions, and it always occurs in a cultural context. But how do you adapt that? What are the changes that means in terms of a methodology for teaching language?
Okay, if you tie that with something else that happened, and again, this isn't the most important article ever written in the world, but it's one that kind of encapsulates the second strand, because one of the things we'll probably say about the communicative approach is it's a funny old animal, because it seems to be trying to do at least two things. And one of them is this whole issue about what you use language for, and the other is how you teach it, or how you learn it. There was an article published by a man called Dick Allwright, and Dick Allwright was doing what many teachers do here at the New School. He and his colleagues would get students going to Essex University who were going to do a postgraduate course at Essex. But they came from all over the world. And depending on their level of English, they needed to get their level of English up to the level where they could study their subject in English at the University of Essex. And I taught on courses like that at the University of Reading myself. Many of you maybe have taught on what we used to call over there, we call them pre-sessional courses, trying to get students up to level. And what Dick Allwright said, and he was following the thoughts of many other people, but what he said is, you know, me and our teachers, we're getting fed up of teaching grammar. It doesn't seem to fit the needs of our students. You know, and we spend all the time correcting people doing the present simple of the third person singular S or whatever it is. I've got that mixed up, but you know what I mean. And, you know, it just doesn't seem to be appropriate for what's going on. That's not what our students need. They need something more. Actually, and they sat around and they talked about this and they came up with their hypothesis. They reckoned that the most important thing the students could do would be to actually do the kind of tasks that they would need to do at the university, and that's what would get them prepared to study at the university. And if I remember the quote right, he said, we hypothesized that if the language teacher's management style was devoted exclusively to getting students to solve problems in the target language, comma, and here's the important bit, then, and I quote, language learning will take care of itself. In other words, if I put you in situations where you have to solve a problem, he'd give them a task where he'd give them a very obscure book that they had to find in the library. You must remember this is in the days of horse and cart, so you couldn't look it up on Google. There was nothing like that. So you'd have to go to the library, then you'd have to talk to the librarian and get lost in the shelves and then do this kind of thing, and he'd give them that as a task. And off they went. And it was a genuine... It had desire and purpose and everything else like that. And crucially, what they said is, we're not going to correct anybody. We'll only help them achieve the task. And we're not going to teach any vocabulary or any of that rubbish. Or you know, because it's if they can do it themselves, if we give them the right task, they'll do it themselves. And remember, blah, 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 comma, then language learning will take care of itself. At the same time, at the University of Reading, back where David Wilkins was, were two particularly influential lecturers and coursebook writers, as it happened, but also applied linguists themselves, called Keith Johnson and Keith Morrow, and another man involved, sadly dead now, called Chris Brumfitt, were involved in that. And Brumfitt and Johnson published a succession of articles in a book, the name of which completely escapes me, and in which Keith Johnson wrote about what he called, and I'm looking for someone, I can't see if I can see him, what he called the deep end strategy. And the deep end strategy is an approach to language teaching which says, you know, there are two ways of teaching someone to swim. One is to say stroke, 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 and the other is to take your child and drop them in the deep end. And it usually works. But the deep end strategy was saying exactly the same. That actually, if you spend all your time concentrating on the bits, students are never going to get a chance to actually use language and do language. And it's the doing and the using and the solving problems that makes you a successful learner of language. And those were the things that really, I mean, there's so much more to say. My brain's gone completely numb now, but there was so much more. But that was the kind of philosophy, wasn't it, underlying that?
Well, that's what, I guess that what you call the deep end approach is what some scholars called the strong version of communicative
Yes.
language teaching. And it was perhaps its most well-known manifestation is what we call task-based learning. And that was sort of happening, was being experimented with around about the same period, particularly by people like Prabhu in southern India. But in contradistinction with what's communicative approach light, if you like, or the weak version of communicative approach, which one, in a sense, or which has prevailed, in your opinion, or even more controversially, to which do you align yourself? And what is the weak version of the communicative approach?
Well, but I'm not going to try and correct you, but I just want to emphasize a bit that task-based learning may be a manifestation of the communicative approach, but it's a much later kind of concept. The communicative approach was there. I must just say that I was teaching at the time in a language school in a place called Bournemouth on the south coast, and when I got hit by communicative fervor, and it was fervor, I tell you, suddenly my poor students didn't get any grammar at all. And I would do masses and masses. They'd do tasks and role plays, and they'd solve problems, and we'd have the most amazingly good fun, and all kinds of things like that. But suddenly we were doing things all the time, and I sort of forgot to teach grammar, for example, quite a lot, because it wasn't right. It wasn't cool. And so I guess I was a pretty strong communicative teacher at that time. The article you mentioned, the 1982 article, makes a point which now looks to me a little bit like dancing on the head of a pin, but at the time seemed very, very important. A problem that seemed to occur, if you remember, we talked about two strands of the communicative approach. One was about the language and the other is about the methodology. So what you would find in the first generation of communicative course books, for example, is that they would certainly have functional language, like asking for directions and offering this and agreeing and disagreeing, which was a fantastic revolution compared to some of the stuff we probably saw when we first started. And they'd introduce a communicative element. The communicative element was often created by something which was absolutely what do we say in British English? The bee's knees at the time, called an information gap activity. And the information gap activity is where I give you some information and I give her some different information. And the only way that you can close the gap between what you know and what you don't know is to talk to each other. And I've created, therefore, a communicative purpose, a communicative desire, a communicative everything. Now, there are two things to say about this. One is when Dick Allwright did these experiments at the University of Essex. Do you remember? Then language learning will take care of itself. This was the first time I'd ever read about things like describe and draw, where he's got a picture and I've got a blank piece of paper and I have to draw the picture he says without looking at his drawing. Or maybe there's a little screen between us and he's got some objects in a certain order and I have to put the objects in the same order, but I can't see what he's got, so he has to tell me. What Dick Allwright said in that very first article, which didn't actually strike me at the beginning, is, some students were able to do that without using very much language. Which is slightly concerning, or is it? Or is it? But the other thing was, if I have an information gap activity which forces you to communicate, but the only thing you communicate is one grammar structure, or one function, then is that a communicative activity or not? Because in the list that you've got there, it says quite specifically that a communicative activity should not just focus on one language structure. It should force you to use all and any of the language you can think of. And so the weak version of the communicative approach was one which said, yes, we will adopt communicative mores, as in getting you to have a purpose and a desire and a reason to talk to each other. We will probably get you to use language for doing, as in advising, apologizing, things like that. But we may very well use techniques which force you to concentrate on specific language. Whereas a strong version of the communicative approach says yes to all the above, and the one thing we're not going to do is force you to use the present perfect. You can use whatever you want. Did I go off the track?
No, not at all. Then from this perspective of 2013, looking back, what do you think, I mean, in a sense, this is the summarizing statement, is what do you think we've gained from the communicative approach, irrespective of whether we're talking about the strong or the weak or whatever, or something in between, and what might we have lost? I mean, you mentioned the fact that you weren't teaching grammar at that time, but I mean, do you think we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater?
I went through a period. I went through a period of being a strong communicative approach teacher, because sometimes we do that. You just go zooming off in one direction, and I think I would not describe myself as that anymore. What did we gain from the communicative approach? We gained, for the first time in my teaching career, a focus on what we get students to do in the classroom and how getting students to use and produce the language is one part of the puzzle. And that when they use and produce language, it's important to let them actually spread their wings and screw up sometimes and try and use what they've been learning. That's why it says they're using all and any of the language that they know. And that we gained that, because I don't recall that being part of the contract that I had with my students when I started teaching. So that was a huge gain. What we lost, well, briefly, we lost some of the other things, it seems to me, that are terribly important in language teaching, I think, which is a concentration on how language is formed and how it works. We became nervous about focusing students' attention on the bits and pieces. Now, we'll probably talk in a minute about the bits and pieces and what that means, but for example, I'm really keen on things like getting students to act out scenes from plays and work on it and rehearse it and get their pronunciation and their stress better and better and better. That didn't fit terribly easily for a bit with me in the idea of students talking. We've lost, if you like, some concentration on controlled practice, although I might not mean by that what some people mean by it. We lost for a bit. As I say, there was an embarrassment about saying, actually, I want to study. I want to get my students to study this particular piece of construction or something like that. And that was a danger. And what we've lost most of all with the communicative approach, or rather what worries me most about the communicative approach, is not so much what people do with it, but what they think they're doing with it. And that's the biggest problem. And I was talking with someone about this the other day, because if you go to any teacher in Thailand, or any teacher in Indonesia, or any teacher in Mexico, or any teacher in Spain, or any teacher in just about anywhere, and say, what kind of a teacher are you? They will say, I'm a communicative teacher. Because you have to be everybody is a communicative teacher. But if you then try and actually ask them, as you've asked me, what it means, you're never going to get an answer which you will find that it means everything and anything to anybody. And that's not good enough for a model of teaching, it seems to me. Have we got to about half an hour, do you think? How are we doing?
Kaden says we've got 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. Ask me a 2-minute question. This is a challenge.
Well, looking ahead now, where we've looked at the past, where do you think, have you any intuitions as to where it's going? And are we at a paradigm shift, perhaps, where something is waiting in the wings to take over, or maybe to make the communicative approach more focused, or to give some meaning to the term communicative, or should we just throw the whole thing out?
It's very difficult very dangerous to make predictions. What's the famous prediction of the IBM prediction in about 1960? The people keep digging up where someone says, we've gone as far as we can go with computers, something they said in about 1960, and everyone says, ha, look at that. So I don't want to, but I don't think the idea that you can get students to do things with language will ever go away. My gut feeling is that there's a kind of shift there's something in the air which is asking us to look again, or maybe it's just me, to look again at how you get students to focus on language. in a different sense from when you're getting students to talk and solve problems. The real issue is, how do you get students to think about language in that kind of context? And I don't think we've thought about that enough, but people are beginning to think about it, is my gut feeling. But you have to ally that to, one of the biggest educational shifts which is going on at the moment, often driven by things like money and power and influence, which is the introduction of educational technology. And if I had a fear, it would be that education technology, which is the most liberating kind of development that's ever happened, may very well soon be used to have the opposite effect, and to almost reduce communication rather than promote it. But that's a whole other discussion, and we might have that later.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you. Do you want to? It's over to you now.
It is indeed over to me,
well, it's over to me. It's over to you who asked the question.
And this should be fun. No, so in a sense, this is a continuation of the discussion that we've been having so far. But just to situate Scott in his kind of time and place, where are you from, Scott?
Oh, well, New Zealand. I was born in New Zealand.
And what kind of, can you just sort of brief idea of your educational background and how you got to where you got to?
I, like you, kind of stumbled into English language teaching. All New Zealanders at some point go overseas, and for a lot of them that means only getting as far as Sydney. And I propelled myself as far as London, and wanting to do exactly what you wanted to do, which is to live in lots of exotic places that weren't New Zealand, I embarked on a similar kind of training program at International House London.
Is there any background of teaching in your family?
No. Well, yes, there is a background in my family, but I didn't think that I was. I mean, I suppose I was disposed towards teaching, but I hadn't really considered it seriously. So it was a kind of in-between traveling kind of thing. But I had a very, it's interesting listening to you talking. I had a very similar kind of Paul on the way to Damascus kind of experience. So halfway through, actually even earlier in this course, I suddenly thought, this fitted me like a glove.
Yeah, it's an incredible thing.
And I love the students, and I love the methodology. I love the fact that it was so practical and so non-academic.
And so I think I want to ask you the same kind of question as you asked me, but maybe in a slightly different form. If we could have gone into your classroom, say 6 months after you'd done your training course, what would we have seen? What kind of a teacher would you be like?
You would have seen a lot of drill and repeat. A lot of drill and repeat. I mean, that was essentially, it was a very, I mean, when I think retrospectively, I suppose we're talking the mid-70s here, and we were at the tail end of what had been audiolingualism in its kind of a son of soft form. I mean, we were taught to use the language laboratory on our course, and there were language laboratories in all the schools I worked in initially, and so you did have to do all that kind of thing. So it looked like an audiolingual school, and a lot of the materials were very, very structure-based, and there was this kind of meanness about the syllabusing, so that you only let students go up the kind of grammatical structure ladder once they'd completely mastered. I remember the first school I taught in overseas, which was in Egypt. We had an 8-week program, and I think for the beginners, it took them as far as the negative of the verb to be. If they were lucky, in the next 8 weeks, they might get into the present continuous WH questions, and another 8 weeks, they'd have to do a whole year before they could ask anybody what they did yesterday. But it was this kind of mean, cost-of kind of approach, because the focus was on getting it right in these little incremental steps, and you got it right by repeating and getting masses of correction. And I was incredibly good at that. Once you learned the technique, it was amazing. It became very, very fluid. Of course, it wasn't the only thing. Then you would practice in rather controlled dialogue kind of situations, but it was very, very artificial. And then there was this notional personalization where then you would say, okay, now you've earned the right. Well, I've just taught you going to over the last 6 weeks. You've earned the right to tell me what you're going to do tomorrow. You've got 2 minutes.
I'm going to interrupt you because I think I know the answer because of what you were saying, but the question that that sort of welling up is did you enjoy teaching like that?
Oh, I loved it.
If I look, not with not
I had
with
complete
hindsight.
control. I loved it. Yeah, I had complete control. I loved it up to the point where I discovered that it was totally ineffective. And then I discovered it was totally ineffective. I'll tell this story quickly, but I was teaching a structure, have you ever, in Egypt, and I used a situation which seemed to be topical, where it was a little exchange between an Egyptian and a tourist, and it went something like, have you seen yet? Have you seen the pyramids yet? No, I haven't. Would you like to go? And have you tasted, name some Egyptian dish, falafel yet? No, I haven't. Would you like to try it? etc. I was working my way through all these situations, and I got to the point where I was running out of kind of examples. So I named a famous Egyptian singer, Kulthum. You may well have heard. I said, have you heard Kulthum yet? And the students were kind of slightly stunned by the fact that I had this insider cultural knowledge, me, a 20-whatever-year-old foreigner. And so one of them said, did you hear Kulthum yet? To me, this was the direct question. So they turned it around when the focus was on meaning. And I said, what are we practicing, Hamdi? What are we practicing? He said, but no, did you hear Kulthum? I said, what are we practicing? The present perfect, you know. So I thought, was ever a situation where the form was most available? In the middle of a drill, it should have been available then. But as soon as the focus went on to meaning, he slipped back into the default structure for the past tense for an Arabic speaker, which is talking about the past, which is the past tense. So it was experiences like that that made me gave me profound, almost religious doubts about the methodology. It just wasn't working. It was working in front of me because everybody was behaving like Pavlov's dogs. But as soon as the focus was on meaning, it all went out the window.
What was I understand that your Damascene moment, although that's probably not the right analogy in an Egyptian classroom. But anyway, but what was your relationship to what anybody was saying about the communicative approach and all that kind of method?
Well, I mean, this was the exciting thing, because having taught in this kind of drill and repeat methodology for about 2 or 3 years, suddenly the word came through. And it came through in the form of various course books which were being written and published in the late 70s, that there was such a thing as the communicative approach. And various academics passing through gave talks about it, and I learned the notion of the information gap and so on and so on and so on. And this was like amazing, because suddenly I could see there was an alternative methodology which fitted exactly what I was missing. That it was meaning focused, and it was just a breath of fresh air. And it had a profound effect on my teaching. And by that stage also, because I had risen up slightly in the ranks of the school I was working in, it had a profound effect on the curriculum of the school, because I basically imposed on the teachers that now you shall now teach the communicative approach. So it's out the window, all these grammar structures, and we're going to now be teaching week 1 narrating, week 2 requesting, week 3 complaining, and so on and so on and so on. It was all focused on particular functions.
And just before you go on, you were saying that one of the things that worried you about being the great audiolingual teacher, which I recall quite clearly also as being terrifically good fun, was that your students didn't appear to be making progress. So when suddenly this all changed and you're in a position to implement this, did you see any shift in student behavior? As I'm asking you to go back into the bogs of time, but you know.
I mean, there was no empirical testing, let's say, of the students' progress. But there certainly, I think, was a sense that there was an enormous relief on the part of students that suddenly the brakes were off, in a sense, and they were allowed to take risks with the language. And also, the other thing, of course, it has a knock-on effect. Once you start to define your syllabus in terms of things that people actually do, you start to have them do those things in the classroom. And so if there is making requests on the syllabus, you're compelled at some point to have them up on their feet making requests and refusing requests. And so you introduced a whole element of theatre and role play into the classroom, which that existed, but it wasn't high priority when I started teaching. And so suddenly the classroom was transformed into a much more communicative space. Not as communicative then, when I think back, as it could have been, but nevertheless it was moving in that direction. So, I mean, I felt better as a teacher, and I hope that was reflected in the students' motivation apart from anything else.
I want to come on in a second to another sort of Damascene moment which we've discussed before, but just something that occurs to me, and again we've talked about this before, is that one of our colleagues, a famous grammarian in Britain, is a man called Michael Swan. who's written a number of really exceptional books. And I had recently the privilege of reviewing a collection of his articles written over a period of 20-something years. And it took me back to articles he wrote in the 1980s, blistering attacks, I think we might say, on the communicative approach. And one of the things he said again and again, and now that I've read his articles in a bunch, I find it coming up again and again and again, is he said the danger of the communicative approach is that we spend too much time doing and not enough time learning. Do you have any response to that?
Yes, I mean, I do, and I think I can see where he's coming from, and to me that encapsulates really the difference between the strong versions and the weak versions of the communicative approach. There's the idea that if you take the weak version, is that you learn a language in order to use it. So there must be some learning plus some using. And the strong version takes the view that you use a language in order to learn it, and I think is a fundamental difference. And the using the language in order to learn it is, in a sense, that notion coincided with the influence on my thinking of Stephen Krashen at the time. So we're thinking back into the mid-'70s, and word was percolating through that there was this kind of guy in the States who was saying, no, you don't learn languages, you simply acquire them. So there was a kind of confluence of those two factors. On the one hand, coming from Europe and Britain, the community with a linguistic background, and on the other hand, coming from psycholinguistics, people like Krashen saying. And to me, this seemed to be very suggestive, because of course we do know people, and we meet them all the time, who've learned languages by using them. And it seemed to me that it must be possible that we can recreate those kind of psycholinguistic and motivational and affective factors that will tap into the, I would say, natural human capacity, even after the first language has been learned, to learn or acquire second languages to a degree. So
I'm not sensing a great sympathy with that criticism.
No, not at all. I think Michael's wrong. I think he emphasizes, I think the using and the learning can work in conjunction. And I would counter that with, you mentioned Chris Brumford earlier, the late Chris Brumford, who was one of the founding architects of the communicative approach. And he said in a book they published in 2001, he said, we may learn the tokens of language formally. We may learn the tokens of language formally, i.e. the tokens, the grammar, the vocabulary, and the phonemes, etc. But we learn the system by using it through reading or writing or conversing. So in other words, the system, the tokens are in a sense activated only. And I kind of hold on to that. This seemed to be the best news that came from the communicative approach, and that it foregrounded using as opposed to learning.
But there is always a tension, isn't there? I don't think it's gone away. And indeed, I saw a talk of yours in Cairo in January this year, where you were looking back at historical descriptions of language teaching, going back to the 1920s. I can't remember if we went earlier, but certainly we're talking, where these kind of distinctions and these kind of dualities were being written about then, and then they get renamed and rediscovered by another generation of teachers. There is always a tension then, isn't there, between learning and doing? And it's not one I think that we've resolved yet.
Not at all, not at all.
But and maybe that'll come up, because when we were talking yesterday about this, you recounted another kind of key, well, it's not so much light bulb as kind of trident or flamey kind of moment, which altered your thinking and what you began to think about.
You mean in the bar and international?
In the bar.
Yeah.
By the way, please don't get nervous. We're not going to talk about that experience in the bar. That's way too difficult.
No,
Which is the bar experience?
Having had this kind of illumination, as it were, and having experienced that major shift in my own teaching, and having felt that it was well grounded in some kind of understanding of psycholinguistics, and having seen materials then being produced by publishers, serious publishers, to try and embody the principles of the communicative approach. And I'm thinking particularly of that series published by Pearson, the Strategies series, which was so enormously influential for a bit. We're talking again late to 70s.
Late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah. We taught from those, and I think that, I mean, we've talked about this before. You say, well, actually, when you peel back those books, the curriculum, and you'll find that although they're notionally all about functions and notions, but there's actually a grammatical syllabus which organizes the functions and notions. And that's almost inevitable, because how do you organize functions and notions in a logical, systematic way? Well, it's, you know, you don't. You just throw them in the air and you see how they fall down. But if you organize them according to the structural complexity of their typical exponents, then of course, but that started to look like a thinly disguised grammatical syllabus. Nevertheless, the methodology, I think, was still intact. In 1986, in the bar in International House, London, I was with a group of friends, and another colleague came down and he had a copy of a book, which had just literally was the first copy of this book that had just been published. He was the author, co-author. And he said, look at this. And so we admired it, and it was in color, which was new. And we said, you might make a few bob out of this. It became a runaway bestseller. It's still in print in various editions.
Just interrupt brackets. What do you mean by a runaway bestseller?
It ran away selling lots of copies.
I was just trying to get you to say something about the scale of its.
Oh, no, massive. I mean, massive. And you'll all know it.
Used by teachers all over.
And there's an American version and so on and so on and so on. But it was the first, but when you opened it and looked at the syllabus, it was all back to what I'd remembered and I thought we'd escape from, which was a structural syllabus. So it was present simple, present continuous, past simple, and here we go again. And there was a functional, notional kind of, but it was tacked on at the end of each unit. It was called Everyday English. And it was like stuff like asking the way and buying train tickets and stuff like that. So I thought this would disappear without trace, this book, because it seemed to be totally out of sync with the zeitgeist, as it were, which was the communicative one. Little did I know that that book would then set the standard, the industry standard for the next, what are we now, 2013, all the way through to now. In other words, open any major ELT textbook, course book series, you'll find that tend to be a mirror image of that original book, which in itself was a mirror image of books that had preceded the communicative approach. So that was a kind of the negative Damascene moment, if you like. It was, for me, it was seen to be the betrayal of what I had thought was this liberating influence in methodology. And I feel it has been betrayed, and it's been betrayed ever since. And I'm not blaming the publishers, because I think it answered a felt need by many teachers to say, I don't know how to teach all these functions and notions. It's just because I don't know how to put them in order. And once we've done all this requesting and that, the students are still as bad as they ever were on the past simple. So it answered that felt need, and it answered it so massively that, as I say, it's still in print. It must have sold billions of copies.
Now, I'm hoping we'll have time to talk about the answers to these next questions. But so what did that shock, or whatever it was, or this feeling you have, what did that lead you to start to think? Here we have someone who is very familiar with audiolingual methodology. That's how he started. That's how we both started. Enjoying drilling. This is great when you get a good drill going. It's one of the best feelings in the world, because they're absolutely in your power. And but then you shift from that and you start a bit like me, but in a sort of slightly different route. You start suddenly getting students to do things and solve problems and do things like that. And then we add in the functions and the notions and all the requesting and the applying. And then suddenly here you are faced with what looks to you like a kind of regression to, here comes the Spanish Inquisition all over again, sort of thing. So what did it make you do?
Well, it made me, by that stage I was training teachers, and so it made me start to question this whole notion of what communicative meant, because just as meant to them, because that's just as you said that communicative is a kind of catch-all phrase, and everybody says I'm a card-carrying communicative teacher, but it seemed to me that what I was seeing when I watched these teachers in their classrooms, there's very little real communication going on. It was all just disguised, and sometimes not that disguised, drill and repeat. And so I kind of embarked on a bit of classroom research, just looking at asking teachers to, for example, record themselves and then analyze the transcripts of sequences to see to what extent it fulfilled Jeremy's 6 criteria of a communicative activity. And it very seldom did. Even the information gap activities seemed to have a subtext, which was to practice the present perfect. Yeah. So this got me thinking deeper into my disenchantment, and I started to look elsewhere for other possible methods that would maintain the flame, as it were, of the communicative approach. And of course, this is where task-based learning interested me. But task-based learning, as you said, seemed often also rather artificial. These tasks seemed rather contrived, or they involved a lot of materials and generally just seemed to be more trouble than they were worth, a lot of management problems associated with them.
Could you give us a quick, I don't know how we're doing for time. Oh, perfect. Could you give us a quick, because many of you are familiar with task-based learning as a concept, but it has a sort of, I know what he's talking about. Do you? In case you don't, what do you mean by task-based?
Well, it might be something like well, you've mentioned already the kind of information gap things, describe and draw and spot the difference, etc. But taking that to a task level, it might be something more elaborate, like planning an outing with the class. These are all the factors you've got to read. You've got 3 weeks, you've got this amount of money, you want to go to these different destinations, these are the train timetables, etc. So it involved much more sharing of information, but it was essentially those very small kind of communicative activities writ large. And they may well be, if you know what the students are going to be doing, just as Dick Allwright anticipated at Essex, that the students who need to do library searches, then the task might well reflect something they need to do. And that's why teaching ESP, teaching English for specific purposes, seemed to lend itself to task-based learning, because you could predict more or less on the basis of needs analysis what the students will need to do. So you just replicated those. More difficult with general English, of course, because you don't really know what students are going to be using the English for. So that's where it got rather contrived. So why I had a strong disposition towards task-based learning in theory, in practice it seemed to be problematic, to say the least. Well, simply because it was difficult to, from a training point of view, it was difficult to persuade teachers to abandon syllabuses, grammatical syllabus anyway, and do task, or adopt a task-based syllabus. And also designing a task-based syllabus is very difficult. Again, same problem with functions and notions. Which tasks do you put in which order, kind of thing. So there were kind of curriculum level problems, but there were also management problems, because they're often involved, students doing all sorts of different things in different parts of the classrooms and never finishing on time, or different groups are finishing before others, etc. So for novice teachers, there are management problems. And then, as I say, there's maybe a lot of reading involved and listening, etc., to get the material that they need for the task and so on. I mean, I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but it created logistic problems.
Okay, and I'm sorry, I was expecting you to go on, but you said those are problems which are practical in nature and difficult to organise. But that's not the only reason why you. Well,
the other thing was they seemed to not relate to the students' affective needs apart from anything else. And I think, again, part of me had been influenced by reading the works of people like Earl Stevick, also around about the same time that I kind of saw the light, as it were, with the communicative approach. So I wanted to include in my teaching a strong humanist, affective, holistic kind of element. And I felt, again, tasks were a little bit too much like hard work for students, and they didn't really tap into what they might enjoy doing. They weren't that necessarily motivating. And I started to increasingly feel that the most motivating thing in the classroom was the people in the room. And if you could create an environment in a classroom where people are actually interested in each other, and there's that kind of dynamic, then actually you don't need this elaborate architecture of tasks and materials. You just get them talking to each other and share. And the best, and Michael Swan said that in that article that you mentioned in 1985, that the best information gap is the information gap that exists between the people in the room. You need to tap into it. You need to exploit it, and you need to make it non-threatening. And that's all to do with, again, it's management, but it's all to do with rapport, dynamics, and so on.
So you've got people in the room.
Mm-hmm.
They can provide you with lots of the content you need to follow the Michael Swan thing. If I can get you to talk to each other, there's enough information gap to keep the conversation going for hours, and so on and so forth. So here you have the students in the room. What do you do with them? Or rather,
get
what
them
do
talking.
Go on.
To get them talking, or...
No, what do you do? Here you are, you've got these students in the room. You're now in a position where you think that a lot of tasks aren't terribly relevant or appropriate to them. So you've got students and you think it's them, the people in the room, who are the focus of your attention. Okay, so what do you do with them?
Well,
what do they do with you? What happens?
We come already with a battery, I think, of speaking tasks, and a lot of good textbooks now, of course, include good discussion tasks and speaking tasks, but they're often at the tail end of a sequence. So you start, going back to your PPP, it's teach the grammar and practice it in a controlled way, and then if they're lucky, then they can go into some kind of discussion or role play. So my tendency was then to say, let's reverse the whole procedure and start with a discussion role play, see how well they do, and then provide instruction at the point of need.
Okay. What happens, who expresses that need?
Well, the students do in one way, in the sense that they say, help me, I want to say this, but I can't. Or they say it in a way which could be improved upon, to be more target-like, for example, or more effective for that. And that's where you might say, okay, just put the students on pause during that thing and say, no, listen to me, or let's see if anybody can help out here. So it's reactive teaching rather than preemptive teaching of the type of the PPP kind of thing.
So what you wouldn't say in the way you're describing it, you wouldn't say today it's Tuesday and therefore we're teaching the third conditional.
You definitely wouldn't. You would wait till the third conditional came up, which would probably be never if you're lucky. So,
well,
it's rare.
It's a very poorly chosen example. There was a famous article that Scott will remember from years ago by a guy called David Moore, which was all about if sentences, and he conducted this amazing piece of research in which he decided to investigate if sentences, and he used a very rigorous method, which was to sit down in front of the television every night with a glass of wine and write down every if sentence he ever came across. And of course, the punchline, of course, which was that what he didn't get as a result of this was many conditionals which fitted the traditional kind of three conditional model. And I must just say that it's still the funniest line I've ever read in an article. The one that he quotes, which still makes me laugh, is somebody on television actually said into the camera, well, if it's in the news, it's in the news. And I still, anyway, but this leads me to a question, because I'd really like to talk to you about emergent language and about something that Scott has been very involved in, which is the development of what is now referred to by many people as teaching unplugged. And maybe in our questions we can talk. And could you summarize Teaching Unplugged in literally about 2 minutes?
Yeah, well, Teaching Unplugged is those of you who were at my session today in the Summer Institute. Thank you for coming along and hearing more about me banging on about this. But and those of you who were here a couple of years ago will know that this actually was born out of an article where I drew an analogy with the film movement, which challenged Hollywood big budget movies, high-tech kind of things. And I saw an analogy with the state that we were seen to be getting into with English language teaching, that we're, in a sense, over-resourced at the expense of these communicative. So there was these teachers saying, I'm a communicative teacher, but you go into the classroom, it's just like masses of handouts and kind of listening to this and reading that, etc., but very little communication of the type that I think is the best possible seedbed, if you like, for language acquisition. So in a kind of moment of a fit of pique, if you like, I said, let's get rid of all this stuff and let's just go back to the original kind of like, the blackboard and the teacher and the people in the room. And that was variously named as Dogma, ELT, and then morphed into Teaching Unplugged, because there was a kind of anti-technology element in it as well. For the very reason, in fact, that you said, or one of the reasons that you said, intimated at earlier, that technology seemed to be leading us back even further into the street, which is technology was simply being used to deliver yet more grammar to the students and not to create, where it could do, to create context in which people actually communicate with each other. And some people are using technology to do exactly that, but sometimes technology is being used, I think, in this kind of degraded sense, simply to deliver grammar nuggets. So yes, so that was my, in a sense, my response to this felt need I had for a methodology which maintained the spirit of the communicative approach, but wasn't task-based learning and all this kind of elaborateness, and which was a kind of pared down, make the most of little, but create the spaces in the classroom, maximize the spaces for real communication. Because after all, with technology, the students can do all that kind of boring stuff like practicing grammar activities outside the classroom. It seems to me that the classroom is a sort of sacred space. It's a very special space. And even people who like and do a lot of online learning, they love coming into classrooms because there's real people in the room. And I think that's the thing that I want to exploit, and that's the point of the dogma thing.
Now, I'm going to ask one last question, which I hope will be a sort of provoker into the discussion we're all going to have. But I've got to ask it absolutely right. And you'll understand, Scott will understand perfectly why. A response to much, Scott's views have been very controversial. Or rather, some of the comments made about the restriction or the over-kerfuffling of language teaching with materials and course books and things like that have caused some people a considerable amount of unease, especially coursebook writers and coursebook publishers. And although my main writing is in the field of methodology, I am also a coursebook writer. I have to, fess up to that. And what coursebook writers have said, and the reason this is such a difficult question is if we spent the rest of the time talking about whether coursebooks are good, this would be a complete waste of the rest of the evening. Nevertheless, it kind of encapsulates some of the issues that come into the communicative approach. As you said, one of the ways that popular courses they do have communicative activities. They sort of have tasks, but frequently at the end of learning lots of stuff. But this is a sort of more profound question, really, I guess, which is that the people who like that kind of thing, and they are legion, say, well, excuse me, we don't agree with you that it didn't work. It does work. Many students all over the world, including some people here who have English not as a first language but as a second language, did actually get it in that kind of situation. Now, it may be that you may do, that the answer could be a bit like the Stephen Krashen answer. When challenged by his theories, he said, well, those people who think they learnt this way didn't, they learnt my way. So I don't know quite how to ask this question without sidetracking completely, but I think what I'm trying to ask is, I find myself increasingly sympathetic to many of the things you're saying. But someone may come back to you and say, but people go other ways too, and they seem to get to the same kind of place with the same kind of success. What do you have to say about that sort of thing? And so that's my last sort of question, and the one which might open us up to discussion. And by the way, it's also a question for the communicative approach people as well.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I'm not despite the name of the wretched movement that I'm associated with, I'm not dogmatic. I'm just dogmatic. I mean, and I'm certainly open to the view that there are as many approaches to learning a second language as there are students in classrooms and teachers, etc. Nevertheless, if you look at the level, you look at success rates, you find that there's probably still a better success rate for people who have actually been airdropped into the country where the language is spoken and have to learn it by dint of talking to the locals than all the billions of people who have sat in classrooms all their lives and only ever got to kind of B1 level on the... Now, of course, you can't airdrop your students into an immersion situation in most contexts. You're stuck with them in a classroom and you've got 30 12-year-olds, etc., so you are constrained enormously. Nevertheless, I still believe that fundamentally we do have the capacity to learn a language by using it, and that I do think we shouldn't give up on that just because it's difficult to manage, it's difficult to write materials for, it's difficult to program, it's difficult to syllabus. I do think that, I mean, I suppose in my heart of hearts, I do subscribe to a strong view of the communicative approach. And so I would say, like Stephen Krashen, if they were learning it by doing all these grammar activities, they were probably actually learning a lot of stuff incidentally because either the teacher was actually providing space in the classroom for a little bit of real communication, or because they are very motivated students who will probably go out and listen and go online, etc., and pick up language anyway. I'm not saying that working your way through a grammatical syllabus is a waste of time. No, it's better than nothing. But I'm saying that there are other things that may be even better.
And I think, as a sort of in conclusion to our little bit, and now we'll move to you, I think that is an entirely controversial thing to say and worth discussing. And maybe that can form the basis of our discussion. What we thought we'd do, I don't know quite how we do this now, we sort of we merge into one person at this point and become
Yes, I think it's time to take questions from the audience. There are microphones that are and as a courtesy to the This is being videoed, so it would help if you voiced your question into the microphone so it can be recorded. And then we will decide between us who will respond.
Hi. I sort of inferred that you were both talking mostly about early level basic acquisition of fluency in language. But does there come a point of transition where the students have now a functional knowledge of the language, and it's time to acquire and develop a knowledge about the language? I teach a course called Next Steps, where students are now, they basically understand everything, and they can make themselves understood, but they have to learn now to get ready for the high school equivalency test, or after that to apply for college. And so isn't that now a time to start learning the carpentry of the language and the way things fit together? And in fact, maybe for some students, given that people learn in different ways, maybe some students can learn just a certain amount about butterflies by seeing them flittering about, but you can learn other things once they're pinned down, and you can look at them carefully, sitting still, and say, this is a participle, and this is a gerund, and these are the different ways that they work. So maybe for some students, they learn better that way all along. But maybe for all students, or almost all, there comes a time to transition into that. So that's my question. Is there room in your worldview for switching into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good point. I think if you liken it to first language acquisition, that we say the trajectory is more or less not dissimilar, that we start off being fluent before we're accurate, and we start off not knowing anything about the language explicitly, but then we learn as we become literate. In fact, I don't see why that trajectory shouldn't. I mean, there's always people who say, oh yeah, but if you let students, and there's evidence to show, if you let them just be fluent from day one, then they will fossilize at a level of they'll develop a kind of classroom pigeon. And I think we have to guard against that. But you don't have to guard against classroom pigeon by teaching the grammar. You guard against classroom pigeon by correcting mistakes.
You see, and this is where there's a little bit of water between us here, I think. First of all, I'm very uneasy about when we start talking about second language learning in terms of first language learning. I can see some of the similarities, but the differences are massive, it seems to me. And particularly when you're talking about a classroom situation, and particularly where you're talking about pubescent and post-pubescent people, the chances of acquisition are incredibly slim, and certainly the acquisition of a first language speaker. I'm also taken quite strongly by your suggestion that different students learn and acquire differently. Now, I'm not a full-on grammarian, and my communicative enthusiasm has not waned entirely, but I'm less committed to doing than Scott is, in a sense, and wonder whether for some students especially a concentration on language and a real analysis of it is actually what will help them best. What we do agree on, perhaps, is what provokes that concentration of things like that, and that's much less easy to have an argument about. But I'm not convinced that just having students do things in classrooms anymore is the only way of doing it. And in particular, if you were talking, for example, if Scott was my private teacher of a language, I would very much hope that he would deal with me as he has just described. I can't see an alternative to that, to dealing with my needs and dealing with what. But if I go to a class I watched in Beijing with 65 16-year-olds, the situation becomes a lot more complex. And that's when I find it, I don't decry anything that Scott is saying. I just want to know how to marry that with some of the constraints in the room and so on and so forth. And he's going to say something about that, or maybe you're not.
Another question?
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the difference between correcting the errors and teaching the grammar, other than the order of them. So if does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
you don't have to teach the grammar to correct errors. I mean, there's different ways of correcting. One way of correcting is telling them, using the meta language, say you just use the past simple in the case of my student in Egypt, but you should have used the present perfect. Or you can just say, no, that's wrong, this is how you say it. And if they say why, you say, well, you've got a number of options. You could say, look, I'm not going to go into it now, because I'm more interested in what you have to say. Just say what I'm saying, and believe me. Or here's a reference in, Betty Azar, look it up there, or whatever. I mean, but you don't have to go into a whole, you see what I mean? You don't have to, oh God. When I started teaching, I was taught a methodology, I suppose, going back to this audio language, which was preemptive. We lived in fear of students making mistakes. We lived in fear because if they made mistakes, they would become
Mistaken.
Yeah, they would become habits, and they would infect other people. We know that doesn't happen anymore. And so that was the best thing, really, about the communicative approach. Or one of the great things, it took the lid off, allowed them to say, make mistakes, make mistakes, make mistakes. It's fun. It's part of learning a language. Everybody makes mistakes. But, of course, then there's a danger that, they'll continue to make mistakes. So this is where the teacher is so useful. We say, no, that's not how we say it. This is how we say it. Just believe me. Now carry on. Yes.
As opposed to error correction.
Well, we had a group. I wouldn't even talk about error correction anymore. I just talk about feedback.
Right. So
Yeah.
I think we spend a lot of time on teachers' courses, and I understand why this is, teaching teachers techniques for correction. I'm guilty of that. No, I'm not guilty of that. Hell, that's the wrong one. I've certainly done that and written about that, and I've got videos showing people doing it. But I'm becoming less convinced of the effectiveness of that. If I had real research time, I would really like to research in more depth what feedback does and how to do it. And straight full-on correction doesn't seem to really cut it, or rather, the way you feed back is something I think we need to consider considerably more detail. And when it's productive, it's fantastic, and when it isn't, nothing happens.
Mm-hmm. Jason.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, you mentioned baby in the bathwater earlier, which is something I think a lot about with the communicative approach. For me and the teachers I work with, we focus more on the baby being the input, like the amount of exposure to the target language, not so much from AudioLingua and the repetition, not so much the, under the microscope butterfly, raising the awareness of how what is a gerund and so forth. In other words, much more exposure, listening and reading to gerund and infinitive complements in order to acquire them naturally. So I wanted to know if you mentioned crashing once, and I'm not trying to get into a crashing thing as much as I'm just wondering where does, the exposure to input to then make, forms correct as opposed to just correcting it. I mean, if you correct it, but you're not offering enough exposure to the correct form,
I'd just like to say very quickly, a discussion I was having this afternoon actually with some people here was the old discussion about TTT and STT, teacher talking time and student talking time, and how everyone always says you mustn't have any of that, you've got to have masses of this. And one of the things we were saying is actually teacher talking time, if it's the right kind of teacher talking time, is unbelievably good for you. It's very good comprehensible input, to use a Krashen term, and the input you get is as important to you, it seems to me, as what you're trying to say. You've got to be careful with that. I don't mean that means the teacher just shouts and lectures at you for hours and hours and hours. Input absolutely matters. But what I am less sure about than I used to be is at what stage, both in that input and in the student's output, and this comes back to your question, I get the students to sort of drill in and drill is entirely the wrong word, I didn't mean, to focus in on the way things are being said or done, and the way people should say things and do it. That, to me, is still, I think that's a real...
Yeah, and I would totally agree. I think that's one point we do agree. I mean, I think going back to the communicative approach, one of the benefits for me was that it suddenly made using authentic materials permissible. In fact, it was actually a core tenet at some early stages that you should only use authentic materials, but it's a huge challenge for teachers, especially if you're teaching lower levels. And so therefore it made you there was two options really with authentic materials. One was just to skate over them very superficially, so the kind of skimming and scanning kind of thing. But that's not what I would call input. I totally agree with Jeremy that actually you need to take a big, deep breath with authentic materials or difficult materials to say, look, we're really going to look at this really closely. So it's not just read it and understand it, but let's read it and pick it apart. And I think you're absolutely on the money there. I mean, I think you could structure your grammar input, if you like, and your vocabulary input by just using the kind of materials, but ideally the materials that the learners are interested in reading or listening to.
Otherwise, they won't get the multiple exposures because they won't do
They
it.
won't get the multiple exposures, exactly. They won't want to read them again, and they'll just tune out. Any more questions? We don't have a lot of time. The lady with a hand up, Jermaine.
What are your concerns about the use of technology, and what are the best uses that we can make using the technology that's coming along?
Now, this is very interesting for me because funnily enough, we're coming closer together on this. At the beginning, when technology came out, Scott at the beginning, I think I would describe Scott as a Luddite. Well, I wouldn't necessarily, but somebody else did. And because he expressed considerable worry about certainly one manifestation of technology, which was the interactive whiteboard, where all the stuff is concentrated at the front for the teacher. And what was offered frequently by that was kind of pre-digested course books, and essentially all you were doing is just making it more fully frontal, essentially. And that took away even the student's ability to kind of mess around with the pages and draw all over it or whatever you liked. And I wasn't quite sure that I thought he was a bit over the top on that, to be honest, in those days. I'm a technophile, by the way. I'm an absolute technophile. My pockets are full of technology and computers, everything else like that. It's incredibly useful. It's really useful when, for example, I've got films of teachers talking about this. There's a teacher I know in Mexico, a teacher called Gloria, and she got her secondary school students in Puerto Vallarta, which is a town in Mexico. She got these kids whose English wasn't that great. She just sent them to the internet and told them to find out about 5 European cities and plan a trip. And they had to, the only stricture was that it had to be English language websites. And these kids went for it. They all said, Miss, we can't do this. Hey, okay, no podemos. She said, go for it, do it. And she pushed them, and they did it, and they had the most wonderful time. And they started saying, when can we go on this trip? And she said, and I had to tell them things like, no, you can't walk from Paris to London, and this kind of thing. But they really went for it. Now that for me is technology, absolutely. How wonderful that you can do that. And how wonderful, for example, that you can get students doing on wikis, co-writing things. How wonderful that you can get students. I've seen some beautiful work. There's a friend of mine, a teacher called Vicky Sarmel from Buenos Aires, and she gets her teenage girls to record and do these wonderful stories using pictures from the internet and stuff like that. And they're so funny. In the same conference in Cairo, I saw a teacher who'd got her students to use fantastic sort of comedy software to rewrite dialogues from Pride and Prejudice in modern English. And I was rolling with laughter. It was just delightful and wonderful. So I'm a huge technophile. And I mustn't go on too long because I'm sure. But what is it that people are beginning to use technology for? And they're beginning to use technology for getting students to plug into systems and to plug into filleted bits. And we had a discussion about this the other day, and I said, Scott, my gut feeling is that if we're not careful, the monetizing of technology, the way of making technology work through money, will have me and Scott in our anecdotage sitting there, and I will hear him saying, oh, the good old days of course books, because the danger of technology is that it's free and wonderful unless somebody's got it and got you and made you sign up for it. Does that make any sense?
You've said it all. I think we're going to have to call it a, shall we, Kate?
I think you must have something to say.
Well, don't start me. I mean, no, I said it earlier. I think when technology is used simply to deliver bits of language, then it seems to be a rather limited. I think the Web 2 kind of possibilities of technology to create learning environments through social networking, etc., that's where I see the possibilities, because anything that promotes communication, and after we've been talking about the communicative approach, and I think if you go right back to the architects of the communicative approach that Jeremy was describing in the mid-70s, people like Dick Allwright would celebrate that aspect of technology, because it does exactly what he was attempting to do with his activities with screens and rods and pictures, etc. Now you can do it in many more different creative ways.
And using things like, I was in Indonesia, and a teacher was talking about how she and her students were on Facebook together in a closed group. They didn't come to her ordinary personal Facebook, but they actually communicated like that, and they communicated with each other outside class time. There's a teacher called Petra Pointner in Germany who did some wonderful talks about how she got a closed Twitter group. And they actually do tweets, and that helps the language. And then she got them to tweet people like me to ask questions and stuff like that. Absolutely fantastic. And as you say, which brings us right back to where we started, communicative, I mean, just perfect in every sense. Mm-hmm. But that may not be the whole story.
So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, we invite you to continue the conversation over by the drinks and food. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.